In this video, I want us to see the explosive impact of one ancient letter on our country today. The early Christian leader Paul wrote in AD 57 to Christians in Rome. We're going to see right now how this letter changed the lives of three people who have shaped the West, our nation, and our culture in ways that we still feel today. The first person is Augustine of Hippo. He lived in the 4th and 5th centuries. One day Augustine stumbled across one verse from Paul's letter to the Romans. He read it and his life was turned upside down. Augustine became a major thinker who shaped the medieval world and whose influence in theology, philosophy, art and music is still felt today. He wrote the first ever autobiography, which is one of the greatest masterpieces of Western literature. But that's a long time ago and it's all a bit philosophical. Fast forward about 1,000 years to a German named Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk. Luther was deeply puzzled by one line in Paul's letter to the Romans. As he pondered it, he came to understand the essential Christian belief that God makes us right with him, not because we have life sorted, not because we've got it nailed, but because of his grace. Despite our many failings, God freely, graciously brings us into a relationship with him when we turn to Jesus and trust in him, what would later be described as amazing grace. Understandably, this rocked Luther to the core. He said, "I felt myself to be reborn and to have gone through open doors into paradise." And so began the Protestant Reformation, which radically transformed Europe. Luther married a nun, brewed beer and had a bowling alley in his garden. He translated the Bible into German and shaped the German language and nation in ways that are still felt today. Luther, the printing press and those who followed him gave us the modern English language, literacy and education. The Reformation paved the way for religious and political freedoms that we continue to enjoy today. But that was 500 years ago in Germany. Well, fast forward to a room in Aldersgate, London, in 1738. And this is where we see the explosive social impact of Paul's ancient letter. A man called John Wesley is in a meeting listening to a book being read out. The book is Luther's preface to Paul's letter to the Romans. You've guessed it. As Wesley hears the message of Paul's letter explained by Luther, Wesley's heart is melted and his life is turned upside down. John Wesley said, "I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone, for my salvation." Now quickly, John Wesley and many others went out beyond the established church into the fields and marketplaces and preached this message to thousands of people. It is estimated that Wesley alone preached 40,000 sermons, travelling 250,000 miles throughout the UK on horseback. But our focus here is not so much the spiritual element, but the massive social change that began here. We owe so much to the movement which Wesley began. Through the 18th and well on into the 19th century, society was transformed by those most affected by Wesley's message. An historian has noted that this movement of national reform literally covered England with reforming organisations and has left a lasting legacy on all English-speaking countries. My kids go to school, but where do our modern schools come from? Well, it was those who followed Wesley who first began to educate ordinary children. People like Robert Raikes and Hannah More. Then others followed them who fought to safeguard children in the factories, then to remove children from the factories, and finally to give them free education as found in the 1870 Education Act. This was a direct product of the message and movement of Wesley, and its impact on individuals like Lord Shaftesbury, who fought many battles and left a lasting legacy for us and our children today. But it wasn't just education. Famous victories like William Wilberforce's fight against the slave trade. Again, this is a direct descendant of this message and this movement. Wilberforce and the individuals known as the Clapham sect, through their actions, their writings and their politics, have left, as someone has noted, an indelible mark on the world. Hundreds of thousands of slaves freed and social values shaped to create a more compassionate society. Organisations we still know today flow down from this movement: the RSPCA, the NSPCC, the YMCA, Bernardo's Homes, and many, many others. Meanwhile, the English prison system was humanised by people like John Howard. Everywhere in society, changes were made to improve people's earthly lives. Children, women, sailors, slaves, animals, the poorest in society, those with mental health problems, the elderly, the sick. Then the modern missionary movement spread these social goods around the world. On into the 19th century, what we see is both the birth of the voluntary sector and an explosion of voluntary societies to meet every conceivable human need. It's agreed that around 75% of these were evangelical in ethos and leadership. They flowed from Wesley and this transformed church, which transformed society. Historian Owen Chadwick states that in the mid-19th century, this Christian movement seemed suddenly to be the most potent religious and moral force in England. The influential British historian David Bebbington notes that this evangelical movement had a profound impact on social life. It displayed much of the vigour and vision and values that began with Wesley, and it continued to be a dominant force in the English-speaking world throughout the rest of the 19th century. Historian Gertrude Himmelfarb noted that French thinkers and the French Revolution didn't produce this community of philanthropists or this explosion of voluntary societies. She notes that without all that we've just seen, the 19th and indeed 20th and 21st centuries would be, as she puts it, unthinkable. We are where we are today because of the impact of this message and this movement on our nation and our world. Now, this video isn't an attempt to explain the total social impact of Christianity. That would have to include subjects as diverse as law, justice, architecture, art, philosophy, healthcare, hospices, ethics, women's rights, equality, democracy, human rights, the welfare state, and many other things besides. But it is to show the spiritual impact of Paul's letter on Augustine, Luther, and Wesley, and through them an explosive social impact on the West, our nation, our culture, our freedoms, our lives, and our world. Why not take a look with us at this letter? It's full of explosive material, but beware, handle with care. It might just change your life forever.